Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who like watching fun guys but hate breathing fun guys. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. Spies, mysteries, horror, romance, SF, it's all on the shelf. And right now we are reading horror novels.
That's right. We're reading Jeff VanderMeer's Southern Reach trilogy, now a tetralogy: Annihilation, Authority, Acceptance, and Absolution. This time, Annihilation.
Hot dog, I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in books like this that feel like they're pulling their techniques and their references from all across the literary landscape to create a kind of mishmash.
Creepy nature mishmash. I'm Bob. I'm interested in monsters, and what kind of monster do we have here, and how is it similar or different to other monsters we've seen, especially in science fiction stories or weird fiction stories? Zach, I was sure that I had read this book before, and I am sure now that I have never read it in my life. I've seen the movie. So when you told me we were going to read this, and I said, oh, okay, I read something else. Never read
Interesting.
this before.
Yeah, because we've brought up this book, I think, more than a couple times, I think, in the course of this podcast. And every time I always got this sense that you were just kind of like, yeah, Annihilation. And I'd always be like, but why?
Talking about a different book, Zach.
Different book. Yeah. I would love to find out what book you were thinking of all this time. Oh, man. Well, this is book one of our journey into Area X. Bob, what did you think? You thought you'd read this before. You hadn't read it before. How did this surprise you?
It surprised me in the nature of the storytelling. It's quite similar to the movie. The movie's very good. It's got Natalie Portman. But I think the way that we are moved into this place, we get a lot more insight through this biologist, this character. There is not much trust between the different characters. The biologist, the architect, the psychologist, and who's the last one, Zach? The surveyor, I think.
The surveyor, yeah.
And maybe the anthropologist or the linguist. They all are going in. They don't know each other's names, or at least they've stopped using each other's names, so we don't know them. But the biologist tells us weird things. For example, the psychologist is hypnotizing them and giving them sentences that suggest for them to do her bidding, and they do not know that it's happening to them. That was a very interesting, weird, kind of almost horror element that's brought into this, as you said, a mishmash of influence. Sometimes it feels very straightforward science fiction where we're getting hard science. We're with this biologist as she is researching biology, but sometimes there are tropes or things that seem inspired from horror.
I like having the biologist be the primary point of view through which we experience this narrative. And actually, I didn't realize that we're not really getting strictly the biologist's experience. What we're actually reading is the biologist's notebook. And I didn't realize this. It's so clever the way that VanderMeer does this. He's describing the scene where she discovers, hundreds of notebooks from all the previous people.
In a pile. Yeah. So you get this sense of the scope of how many people have just been pushed through the meat grinder here. And at this moment, the narrative switches to a second person and it says, you might be looking at this same pile right now. And that's all it says, but that is exactly the switch that's flipped to let you know that the intended idea here is that you might be a person who just picked up a random notebook and now you are reading the biologist's tale. Which is classic horror. We've seen that in Castle of Otranto, where it's a found document. And, we're being told, I found this, it's 100 years old, and now here's the truth. It's all written down on these pieces of paper that were left behind. It is very much a found document horror. It even gets stranger, too, because she also reveals to us, not only are we now entangled in this, we are going through the same meat grinder that she went through. She also tells us, look, I'm not exactly me anymore. I've been writing this diary or this journal very intentionally, withholding certain pieces of who I am now. And who I am is a lot different from how she starts out in the narrative.
There's a really nice and a really rewarding way in which the speaker withholds, I guess, like the status of her possible infection from not only the characters around her, but also like
the readers themselves. We find that the spores that have entered her body have fundamentally reshaped the way she experiences the world, the way she sees things. I think that what makes the story so interesting, though, is we don't need the narrator to tell us that. I mean, we need the narrator to tell us the full extent of that, but just look at the writing in this book. It reminds me of reading like 18th century German romantic. So like right now, my wife and I are reading The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. And that is all about kind of losing yourself in nature. That kind of 18th century romantic thing where it's like, the magical sublimity in which nature is a reflection of the supremacy of God, that sort of thing. You see this also in another book we covered, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, is echoing these kind of romantic ideas about the relationship between mankind and nature, but almost satirizing them. Like he's a German romantic character in the story. When we enter Area X, we start getting all of these insane descriptions of nature. Here's how chapter 3 starts. As the trail became a raised berm, dull, algae-choked lakes spread out to the right and a canal flanked it to the left. Rough channels of water meandered out in a maze through a forest of reeds on the canal side. An island, oasis of wind-contorted trees, appeared in the distance like sudden revelations. The stooped and blackened appearance of these trees was shocking against the vast and shimmering gold brown of the reeds. The strange quality of light upon this habitat, the stillness of it all, the sense of waiting, brought me halfway to a kind of ecstasy. So you can see that she's like, as soon as she enters the area, the headspace has changed. The voice has changed. We've entered a new way of interacting with the world once we enter Area X.
Well, Zach, I got a big question for you about this because it's scary, I think, in a way. And I have a question for you in just a minute. But let me talk a little bit about, there's this great video with VanderMeer and Farrar, Straus, and Giroux did. It's called Life in the Broken Places, and it's when he was putting out Born. So it comes after the trilogy, but before the fourth book. And he says at the very beginning, you might wonder why I've taken you to the Tallahassee wastewater treatment plant. Well, it's great for bird watching. And the video is him, behind like these fences with binoculars trying to find these birds. And he says, look, life that exists in a place where you might not expect it is life coming back, and it's kind of taking over. It was a wild place that became an urban place, and now the wild is coming back again. He also takes them into to St. Mark's Lighthouse, which is where he got the inspiration for what the biologist calls as a tower, and everyone else seems to call a tunnel. And it's on the Gulf Coast. And so he had been wandering around here coming up with these ideas, he said, for about 20 years until he said it totally saturated and entered his unconscious. And then these ideas just started flowing into him after a dental treatment. But anyway, so these ideas start coming. He says he's starting to hallucinate after all the Novocaine or whatever. They knocked him out at a dental treatment. Anyway, he says that he wants to convey an experience with nature and a way we negotiate with living things in spaces. And then he says, life in the broken places, life in contamination, is still worth preserving. However, at the end of Annihilation, I haven't read the other books, it's a little frightening. She's changing in ways that seem no longer human, and she runs into a monster I want to talk about later, who maybe is a monster, maybe is almost a deity for this place, but it is very frightening, and it causes her the most pain she has ever experienced, and it happens again and again and again. It's almost evil. It feels like the Shrike, Dan Simmons' Shrike. But do you think this is a good transformation for the biologist? Is Area X good? Or is this horror? Is this pure horror?
I think the answer could be a little bit of both. But I'll respond to the second part first, in that, yes, it is pure horror, only because it seems impossible for anyone to actually know what is going on with this place. I mean, as they say in the book, they just keep throwing these people with highly specialized knowledge, skill sets in there to see what they make of it. Can anyone's expertise come to any kind of conclusion about what's going on here? And the answer again and again and again is no. So that's the horror, that there's a transformation that's happening, but it's a logic that no one can understand. No one can wrap their head around it. VanderMeer calls Area X a hyperobject at one point, which is like a term in philosophy about an object so large or so stretched across time that one person's consciousness cannot grasp the entirety of it. It's just larger than we can conceive. And there's a horror in that, it's kind of sublime horror, I think, of just something it's not the horror of someone holding a knife and running at you. It's the horror of standing in front of like a melting iceberg and just being like, oh my God, as it crumbles into the sea. But is it good? So to get back to your question, is it good? Could it be good? I guess the thing is that we don't know. And I don't feel like there's any attempt to answer that. There's a lot of really cool things that happen, like the people who disappear in the area come back, but there's something strange about them. They're missing their personalities. They're looking at the world through a veil of mist and fog. It's as if they have no character anymore. And then they all mysteriously get cancer. I think it said systematically spread throughout their body.
Inoperable systematic cancer,
yeah. Yeah. And then they just die 6 months later. Now, that, like, if I just told you that was the thing that was happening, you'd be like, oh, that's bad. But somehow it feels almost value free. Does that make sense? Like, it's not like they come out and start, murdering. It's not like Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, possibly the origin of this trope and this idea. I strongly suspect that he kind of lifted up this really wonderful aspect from that story. Despite the monstrousness and the kind of confusion and just the astounding nature of it, I never feel true malevolence about the whole thing. It doesn't feel bad. That doesn't make it good, but it doesn't feel bad to me.
You mentioned Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Great book, underrated book. But another book I was thinking a little bit of is The Island of Dr. Moreau. Now, while that is an experience, a scientist combining animals, doing strange things, this seems to be nature becoming a scientist, and it doesn't exactly have, well, at least its intelligence is unreadable. It's unintelligible to us. Because as you said, we don't really know if it's malevolent or not. It just is. And it seems that the writer, or at least the biologist who is now infected with this nature, doesn't seem to think it's evil. It just is. But there is an uncanny uncomfortableness, especially when, yes, the doppelgangers come and they turn out not to be really sustainable beings. They deteriorate. But I think it's scary when we see these animals who have human faces inside of them. There's the scene where she's going towards the water, towards the beach, and she finds a sloughed off skin of an animal that is a human face. And so it's a dolphin or an alligator or something that is shedding this old humanity, or just routinely sheds these things. And she says it even looks like a horseshoe crab almost, but with a human face implanted on the back of it. There is also a monster that she does not see yet in this book, but is wandering through the reeds, and it chases her, and it moans and screams as if in terrible agony and pain, and it sounds like a human moaning and limping through the reeds. That seems like hell. So while we can't necessarily judge Area X, this weird reproduction of human beings seems to be hellish. Whereas everything else might be natural, the way that it's interacting with humanity is not natural. It seems very almost demonic or disturbing at a level that's not just uncanny, but seems evil.
Okay, for sure. Like, maybe for the individuals involved, they would probably argue it's not a good thing. Like that moment she walks into the old abandoned house and there's was it like the fungus plumes, or was it like a hedge brush or something like that was in the shape of people sitting around like a living room area, and the protagonist gets the sense that there's some action happening that is still in action, like she's just interrupted something in motion, but they're just motionless plants.
To me, the moments with the people trying to fight the sea, that seems like madness. It doesn't seem like an intentional, we think we're going to beat something. At the end, she is talking about what really happened. She's giving all of these theories, the biologist is. Why is Area X like this? And she says, it's like a thorn. There's this kind of alien thorn that is now in the side of the earth right here in Area X, and it has infected this place. So whatever it's doing, it's growing, it's trying to spread. And one reason that the Southern Reach won't send in modern technology is because it seems to learn these things. When the crawler is going back and forth, it seems, in this lighthouse to write all of these strange biblical, mutterings on the wall. It's like, whatever it is, she compares it to, what does she compare it to, a starling or the kinds of birds that use nests? No, she compares it to wasps. That's what it is. So when wasps are making their nests, they use their own material, but they also find whatever is there, and so they will make a nest around it, and kind of integrate it into their own structure. Area X seems to be doing the same thing, and that's why they can't send in this modern technology. But why continue to send people in there and then they go mad? I know that they're just hoping something sticks, but there's something even insane about Area X, not just the whatever nature is doing, it seems to be doing. The Southern Reach people, I don't know, they seem to want to torture these people. It doesn't seem realistic that anyone's going to solve this. But let me share a quote with you that I thought was really interesting, where he's at this festival called Sonic Acts, and he's sharing why he wrote the Southern Reach trilogy and his inspiration for it, and his inspiration to make this part of, to interact with, I guess, all science fiction canon. I'll say that. He wants it to be a statement for science fiction. And he says, look, right now there is a tendency to make all of these new genres. One is called cli-fi, climate action sci-fi. Another one, eco-fabulism. And he says it's a capsule that just turns out to be a placebo. So we make these genres and we enshrine them and we say, look, this stuff is really helping. It is the answer to our climate problems, but really it's just a book. And so he says also that dystopian fiction has turned into a tea-cozy, comfortable genre. And he says it's naivete infused with murder. So we just like dystopian novels. It's very cozy. But do you think that part of the reason it's totally ambiguous about whether Area X is evil or not, whether Southern Reach is evil or not, do you think he's trying to do something with the genre, the whole science fiction genre here, as something that has an impact, is my question, I guess?
That's a really interesting question. I just want to say before I answer that, I feel like it's so rare to hear authors talk about genre as genre and talk negatively of entire genres. I think that's interesting, but there's also a fundamental, I guess, truth to the idea that dystopian fiction has become a kind of tea-cozy genre. I mean, the marketing copy of most dystopian novels would kind of place them within a kind of like political engagement, or like read this as like a kind of activist kind of thing. Like you can, to educate yourself about an issue. But I can't think of the last time I read a dystopian novel that actually did anything. You know what I mean? It's all just reading books. And I think he's right in that regard. Now, to your question about how does this perspective that he's offering play into his characterization of Area X, I think that if he wrote just a story about a wicked, evil environment, it would not be half as compelling as it is. This book makes you think. It makes you consider. It makes you say, oh, what is it? It makes us talk. Is this good or is it bad? That's a much more interesting text than just being like, oh yeah, this is a story about an evil area of ecology taking over. It's good versus evil stories don't make you think. And when they don't make you think, they don't change the world. Good versus evil stories just make you turn your brain off like it's Star Wars and you just read through waiting for the good guys to win.
I do love Star Wars though. Okay, so I think that relates to another one of his theories about what is the point of fiction. He says that fiction is contamination of the writer by something foreign to the self. And if you're lucky and yet intimate to it, it's the contamination of readers who themselves mutate and also mutate the text in reading the text. Do you think... So earlier you said, okay, I haven't read a dystopian fiction that really made me think, okay, I need to change something or this will change the world. Do you think in being somewhat ambiguous and in being almost deliberately a mutual kind of mutation, could the Southern Reach tetralogy now, could it be more significant than other works we've read?
I think it remains to be seen on where they take it. We still have 3 books left. I've read books 1 through 3. I've not read number 4. You've only read number 1. I will say that the idea of humanity, human civilization, bulldozing over nature, and then nature, ecology, coming back and recolonizing these areas, in these micro niches, these micro habitats, that is interesting to me. And that will make me look more around the world at me of like, okay, where does life exist here? There's a pond by my apartment complex that I think is just wastewater, but I know that when I walk by, I hear bullfrogs all the time.
Whoa.
What's the story of these bullfrogs? This book kind of makes you ask these kinds of questions. What are they doing down there?
If you find a 3-eyed one, you should name it Blinky.
Yes. The other thing that I think this book is stunningly successful at is a tactic that I think was in some way borrowed from H.P. Lovecraft, which is making the natural world weird again, like actual creatures weird again, in the sense that H.P. Lovecraft, he doesn't describe his monsters very clearly. He describes them very ambiguously, but he gives them tentacles because tentacled creatures are weird. So therefore, if you have a giant tentacled creature, it's extra weird. VanderMeer is doing the reverse tactic. He's saying, I know tentacled creatures are weird. Let's look at this starfish now. And he'll spend paragraphs lovingly describing a starfish in a way that makes you be like, good God, these are aliens living in our ocean,
That thing is so frightening. It's called the Crown of Thorns, and it's also called the Destroyer of Worlds. It's a frightening, frightening starfish. Yes, I love that too, how he is making things, like I mentioned the beast earlier that's moaning and in the reeds, and it might be human. She sees a dolphin that looks at her, and it looks at her like this, and then she says, I think I've seen that eye before, and realizes it's the guy in one of the old tapes who said, everything about Area X was totally fine. It was a nice little time out in nature, but now he's a dolphin creature. Yes, I think that was so interesting. However, I think the style is quite different, and I'm very interested to see how Jeff VanderMeer is inspired by weird fiction, because we're going to start reading. This is one of the reasons we're reading The Southern Reach, but we're going to read the anthology that he worked on with his wife, Anne VanderMeer, called The Weird, 100 stories of weird fiction through almost 150 years, I think. I want to see how that style has influenced his style, because while this is quite weird, it is a very sober telling, I feel like. Whereas H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, especially, they are like people spiraling off into madness as they describe things, and there are so many adjectives, so many adverbs. It's almost purple, but in a very wonderful way. This is sober. You read the beautiful passage about nature, however, it is still quite straightforward and like a biologist wrote it. I think it's intentional to be realistic for how a biologist would explain things, but I also wonder how much is our modern day, as readers, how much is our opinion about how writing should be written informing that style too? In another lecture, he talked about wanting to make it appealing to a wide audience, so he chose to be somewhat sober in the telling, whereas H.P. Lovecraft is almost like an intoxicated style. Do you think that this really, as VanderMeer is the king of the weird almost, he's made this anthology, is this still weird fiction, even though it's not really in the intoxicated style?
Well, I think it is, but I think that we have to think about how we define weird fiction, because that intoxicated style feels to me like like it's a moment in time. You know what I mean? Like it's an early 20th century thing where people are writing hyperbolically about, it's so weird. You won't believe how weird it is. But I think that this is my bold theory. We're going to be proved right or wrong on this when we read the anthology. But my theory is that modern weird fiction is more influenced by experimental writing and poetry, writing where meaning is harder and harder to chase down. Now, this is a very, like you said, it's a very standard prose book. But I want to read a quote real quick, because even if it reads like very, very standard prose, the interpretation can be so rich. Mm-hmm. So like take this moment when they first wake up in Area X, and there's this weird relationship with the psychologist and all of the other people who are still coming back to consciousness. For example, I noticed the cruelty of an almost imperceptible smile on the psychologist's lips as she watched us struggle to adjust, the anthropologist still floundering and apologizing for floundering. Later, I realized I might have misread her expression. It might have been pained or self-pitying. So in one, 2 sentences, and you have 2 entirely different readings of character motivations that spiral out in opposite directions. And you as a reader have to decide which one you think it is. Is the psychologist cruel, smiling at watching them struggle? Or is it a smile of her own pain and her own self-pity? These, you could even say it's both. You know what I mean? The part of the weirdness of this text is that meaning itself of who these people are, of what their experience is, of what they actually are seeing. All of it is just so difficult to pin down. And I think, to me, that characterizes the weird style right now.
That's very interesting. So not being even able to sit comfortably in one narrative. It's one narrative, but I guess the narrator, do we trust them or not? They are changing before our eyes. I'm having a similar experience then with the monster, or the crawler. I guess no one calls it the monster but me. But this crawler, this enormous thing, it's described almost as H.P. Lovecraft would describe a monster. But it really reminds me, when we were reading Dangerous Visions, and we read the PKD story, the Philip K. Dick story, Faith of Our Fathers, and there was this strange monster character who everyone sees differently, and it appears many times, so everyone has described it differently. And here, this crawler, when she goes and confronts it, she's already seen its footprints. It's got this track like a slug or a snail, but it's gigantic. It's 10 meters wide or something like. It's huge, and it's got all of these other appendages that help it walk as well. So its track through space is very strange. But then when she confronts it, it seems to be shifting, and it hits her, she says, like a giant wave, and she feels like she's drowning. Then, as you said before too, it just pumps her full of all of these spores or all of this fungus. It's not really, we can't tell, but she says, it felt like I was being rammed in my skull with this iron rod again and again and again. And it was like tearing me apart and rebuilding me again, because she's already infected with it, or with whatever animates it or whatever powers it. It reminds me of other monsters too, not just the one in Philip K. Dick, but the Shrike I said earlier. It reminds me a little bit of Dracula when we read Dracula. I have no idea where this is going with this thing. It could be godlike. It could just be an evil monster. I'm really excited to see what happens in later books. But what do you think? Can we compare it to other science fiction monsters that we've seen? Is it similar at all to the Shrike?
I think the Shrike is a really good comparison point. The Shrike from Dan Simmons' Hyperion series. Of course, as that series goes on, he gives more and more background information on the Shrike. Yeah, retcon. He turns the Shrike from an elusive thing into a literal character. You know what I mean? But Hyperion, the first book, Shrike, is monstrous and ambiguous and, omnipotent, omnipresent. It's everything. And I do think that this creature, the crawler, is described in ways that really remind me of that. I mean, it reminds me of it in the way that it's not described. If memory serves, he describes the crawler, the experience of looking at the crawler, as kind of like refracted panes of light. And he just uses words like vastness to describe it. It's so cosmic. It's like a cosmic space ghost, like the experience of being in it. But it's like, if I just told you that, there's a being made of panes of light, that's not scary. It's not necessarily a threat. And yet, somehow it feels, cosmic. Like cosmic terror when we encounter it. And part of that is like you said, the pain that it causes.
So while we don't know if it's malevolent or not, or if it's evil or good, it seems to be written almost like a religious experience. I don't know if you were thinking that, but when she's now become a different kind of creature, it almost felt like a very violent, terrifying baptism. And it feels like an encounter with the backside of God, almost, where this thing is creating, and it seems to be writing in this biblical prose that is unhinged biblical prose, unintelligible. And then when it confronts her, it's so terrible. It's like seeing a god in its true form. You know, when a mortal asks to see the god face up to actually see them, it's horrible and it burns you alive. This happens, however, she is also fundamentally changed so she can survive, or she's almost dead and born again. Did you pick up any religious kind of, not content, but any religious feeling, I guess?
You know, it's really funny you brought that up because while reading it, I thought of that moment in Indiana Jones when they open the Ark of the Covenant and the guy turns around to look at it. There is this aspect of it. I guess it goes back to the idea of a hyperobject. You know, the area is a hyperobject and that we can't understand what it is. But the being, the crawler at the center of this hyperobject is itself a hyperobject in the sense that not only can we not really pin down what exactly it is it light? Is it a slug? Yeah. Is it a lighthouse keeper? You know, like which of these things is it, or is it none of these things? But also, we can't physically experience it. It is so beyond the realm of experience. And furthermore, to get back to a much previous point, we don't know what it's doing. It's writing this poetry that's like indecipherable. It's digging a tunnel down to a doorway of light. And when it kills people, or like when it hurts people, I guess I should say, it's not written in a way that suggests malevolence. To bring it back to the Shrike from Dan Simmons' Hyperion, we know that when that creature snatches people away, it sticks them on a giant tree made of thorns where they just suffer for eternity. It's trying to maximize suffering. Here, people suffer because of the crawler, but I never got the sense that the crawler was trying to make people suffer. It's almost like a side effect of being in the presence of the crawler.
It does feel like a side effect. It just feels angry because the crawler is doing its thing. It's doing its weird creative expression, which we don't know if it's creative or just like it's being an automaton just writing this. But it's almost like when you have a confrontation directly with your unconscious and it gets angry that you are looking at it and it attacks because it's busy doing its work. And then when you, it's writing, whatever, you know, and then you get too close and it can hurt a lot. I'm really excited to see when VanderMeer is talking about his process and saying, look, I was there over at St. Mark's Lighthouse being inspired by nature and it connected. It kind of fused into my unconscious, and it was almost like creating this book is kind of, to me, it feels like wandering through his own unconscious. He's really created a place for himself to play. But I want to see how the crawler evolves, not just the science fiction aspect of it, I guess, as a monster, but also how does it relate to his creative process? Why did it come up to him, I guess, and how is he going to use it as a storytelling device? Because it seems it's very integral to his inspiration. Not just it's part of the story, but it seems to be a mechanism for inspiration. So I'm just excited to see in the future books what this thing turns out to be.
Well, I am really excited to see where this story goes next, what VanderMeer does with it. I'm also interested to see if his style changes, if the way it's put together shifts between the books. I'm not sure if they were all written at the same time and then released later, or if they were actually subsequently written one after the other. Maybe that's a point of research before the next one. But regardless of what that answer is, will we see differences in style across them? So lots to look forward to. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.